This is English for Politics and Administration. And we're on to class number 4. And today's topic is war. So we'll consider what is war, how the nature of war has changed over the centuries, and how international relations writers have thought about war, and we might also touch upon some of the sort of legal aspects of warfare. Before we go there, there is a nice cartoon which has an international relations aspect to it, and some vocabulary here, which might also prove to be quite useful. So we can see in the picture, if we were going to describe it, in the background, we can see the building, which looks to me at least as though it is the US Congress. Beyond that, we can see the Washington Monument. And then in front of that, in the foreground, we can say, are those buildings, a factory looking sort of construction, with these pipes coming out of it, and the factory is labelled Military Industrial Complex, and that is a good sort of international relations concept. I'll come back to that in a moment. We've got the US Treasury. That's obviously the sort of finance department, so the bit of the US government that looks after the money. And then these pipes coming out with lots and lots of what looks to be like dollar bills. And we've got labelled on one pipe DoD budget. The DoD is, of course, the Department of Defense, and about $715 billion annually. So the United States, I think I've said this before, but the United States basically spends more money on defense than most of the world combined. The second largest spender is China, and surprisingly, China I think is currently spending around $200 billion, maybe slightly less than that, I haven't checked. But about a third of what the United States spends on defense, and then after that you've got countries like Saudi Arabia and Russia and Britain, etc. And they're paying under 100 billion on defense. So the United States spends a terrific amount of money on defense. Another smaller pipe, Afghan war, 40 billion being spent annually. And it's not a particularly funny cartoon, but a picture of Uncle Sam, obviously representing the United States. Well, that was just pouring money down a hole. And I think this must be a reference to the announcement that the Biden administration said that they were going to withdraw troops from Afghanistan by September the 11th this year. So literally the 20th anniversary of 9/11. And the point, I suppose, that the cartoonist was saying there, that the United States has spent an awful lot of money and perhaps achieved relatively little. The Taliban are still not been defeated in Afghanistan. They may well sort of return back to power once the United States has withdrawn. So yeah, questions to be asked there. Go back to the military-industrial complex. As I say, this is an idea that's been around for quite some time. It was actually President Eisenhower who first used this phrase. He described the military-industrial complex in his farewell address. So just as he was leaving the presidency in what would it have been, 1961, I guess. And he warned of the dangers of the military-industrial complex, and essentially was saying that the U.S. military, the defense industries, they were all they represented a sort of very powerful and very influential political bloc, and Eisenhower was simply sort of warning that perhaps they had too much influence, perhaps even they could actually use their influence on decision makers to engage in foreign wars and things like that. And interesting that it came from Eisenhower, because he was obviously a general before he became president, so he was somebody who was very familiar with how the military worked and presumably its relations with the defense industry and things like that. Okay, and we have here a newspaper headline. This was from a few weeks ago now, so it's not that fresh. And I won't spend too long on this, but I'll quickly just go through the headline. It says the US joins calls for transparent science-based investigation into COVID origins. So transparent, something is transparent, you can literally see through it. So glass can be described as transparent. In a sort of political context, it's basically referring to something being open so that you can see what is happening. So transparency is seen as, in a democracy at least, is seen as a good thing. Science-based investigation into COVID origins. Several countries tell the WHO, that's obviously the World Health Organization, annual meeting that a new inquiry with new terms of reference must be launched. So a new inquiry, new investigation, śledztwo, I think it is in Polish, isn't it? With new terms of reference. So basically, providing new terms for what actually should be investigation. Launched meaning to begin, so you launch an inquiry. Move to the next slide. This is Google Translate's version, and I'm just reading it myself. I think it's okay, but that familiar with, so I should probably learn some of that myself. And a little bit of text. I don't think I will spend much time now going through it. You can look at it yourself. I should say I haven't provided a reference, but this is from The Guardian, as I say, a few weeks ago. It appeared on their website. Yeah, I can't see any vocabulary here that is useful. I think we've mentioned the main things already. So on to the next slide, another cartoon, not making a similar point to the previous cartoon. So essentially, again, a reference to the military budget and how much the United States spends on defense. At the top, we've got, in one corner, top left, war, the other corner, jobs. Big budget there. And we've got the Dems and the GOP. The Dems, I think we've mentioned this before, but often depicted in cartoons as donkeys. The GOP, that stands for the Grand Old Party, which is another reference to the Republican Party. And they are often represented in cartoons as elephants. And they are sort of piling, they've got two, in English, wheelbarrows. I'm trying to remember what wheelbarrow is in Polish. So two wheelbarrows full of money, which they are going to pour into the budget. Then in the far corner, jobs, and there's a small child there, looking like he is begging on the street or something, with help, and a reference there to domestic spending. And one of the two parties saying, isn't there some kind of law against panhandling? I think panhandling is another word for begging. It might be American English. It's not a term I'm that familiar with. And then down in the far corner, he looks like a potential terrorist to me, he's saying, which is interesting. And yeah, the point being made here, obviously, I think it's fairly self-evident, but just sort of making the contrast between what the United States actually spends on defense and compared to what it actually spends on domestic services and things like that. So you think of stuff like hospitals, schools, all the other stuff that we tend to take for granted in everyday life, and there is a huge disparity. Obviously, this is a reference to federal spending, so obviously at the level of states in America. States also spend a lot of money on domestic things, but if you look at the actual federal budget, by far the largest slice of spending in the budget, well over half, I think, is on the military. Okay, we have a map here, and the title saying "The World at War in 2020." Countries with reported armed clashes between state forces and or rebels in 2020. Okay, so that's an interesting definition. We'll come back to that in a moment. Just have a quick look at the map so we can see the world here, and countries in red, obviously, those countries which are experiencing these types of armed clashes. And if we look at the distribution, it's I think it's fairly sort of clear which parts of the world seem to be most, seem to be experiencing the most, let's say, these armed clashes. So taking North America, Europe, in North America, Mexico. We might come back to that in a moment. Europe, Ukraine. But aside from Mexico and Ukraine, Europe and North America seemingly sort of relatively clear of armed conflict. South America, there's countries like Venezuela, Colombia, one or two others on that continent. But the continent that clearly is experiencing the most, conflict is, I think, unsurprisingly, Africa, and mainly sort of northern and central Africa, isn't it? We can see here. So we've got the countries in the north that they include Egypt, Libya, Algeria, Tunisia, I think, isn't it, in the top there. Horn of Africa, so Ethiopia, Sudan, Somalia, that part of Africa, and then into Central Africa, which is the name keeps changing of the country there. But today, the Congo, I suppose today we would call it. It's gone through several names in its history. So yeah, Africa clearly a country which is sort of experiencing quite a lot of conflict in a moment. Middle East, again, unsurprisingly, I think, is another area. So Turkey, Syria, obviously, Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, then into Southeast Asia, parts of Southeast Asia as well. And then into Indonesia. Okay. Right. Just break it down into slightly more detail. Well, first of all, I think the methodology is interesting. And it's not giving us an explanation on the map. Maybe there is somewhere else, but I haven't checked. But it isn't giving us an explanation as to what the people who drew up this map defined as an armed conflict. Now, I suppose in sort of conventional international relations theory, when we talk about war, it's often referred to as wars between states. So wars between particular countries. And that's sort of how sort of realists sort of have tended to sort of view warfare. Here it says clashes between state forces and or rebels. Okay, so rebels, somebody, if you are rebelling, it means you are fighting against a government or something like that. So that may well be a reference to civil wars or wars within particular states. A civil war, wojna domowa. So not necessarily a war between states, but a war that could be happening within a state, or it could be particular sort of terrorist groups. So having a look at Africa, for example, particularly Northern Africa, many of these African countries are dealing with sort of radical Islamic sort of terrorist groups. So there's a lot of fighting going on there. Take Nigeria, for example. They've had big security problems with Boko Haram. Again, a very sort of radical Islamicist organization. So presumably, yeah, this map is sort of referring not just to wars between countries, but actually wars within countries. And a lot of these groups may actually operate in several countries. So they sort of move between various borders. Armed clashes. I mean, it begs the question. If you say it begs the question, it sort of raises the question, or you tend to think about the question. But what actually counts as a sort of armed clash? So how many people need to be involved before it is sort of thought to be a significant clash. So presumably, it would simply be more than one person just waving a gun around. It would presumably you're talking about several. How many, as I say, it sort of raises an interesting methodological question as to exactly when does it become an armed clash. Looking at other parts of the map, again, Syria, so a civil war there. Other parts of the Middle East in recent years has also experienced a great deal of turbulence. Then India, Pakistan, those are two states which historically have had very, very difficult relations. Afghanistan, obviously, we've mentioned before. Mexico. Presumably, this is a sort of reference to drug cartels and the fact that the Mexican government is having to, is trying, not without too much success, you might say, in trying to sort of contain their activities, and similar activities. One would think in Colombia, similar problems, I should say, in Colombia. Venezuela is a state that's sort of on the brink of collapse, given what's happened there. So yeah, in general, just looking at the map more generally, in terms of looking at which parts of the world seem to be experiencing the most conflict. I mean, clearly, it is the poorer countries. So if you look at Africa, especially, it's the poorer parts of Africa, particularly Central Africa, the Horn of Africa, as I mentioned, which is the eastern part, Ethiopia, etc. And then I suppose the sort of northern Islamic belt, which has been very unstable since the Arab Spring in 2010, 2011. The revolutions broke out there, and then obviously Iraq, Afghanistan. They've been particularly unstable since the war on terror began in 2001. So let's go back to a slightly more sort of traditional international relations view of war and conflict. And when you look at the textbooks, this guy is often cited. This was the Prussia, obviously, which was once part of today's Germany. So this was the Prussian military theorist. He was a general in the Prussian army, and he wrote a very famous book, which in English is translated into On War. So Clausewitz sort of describes what war is, and what war's purpose is. And Clausewitz, you might say, has a fairly sort of realist view of war. And in one of his most famous quotations, he describes war. Again, it's sort of translated differently. There are different variations of this depending on the particular translation into English. Probably the most famous, though, it's translated as war is the continuation of foreign policy by other means. Okay, so war is the continuation of foreign policy by other means. What he basically is saying here is that statesmen, governments, that they use war as a political instrument. So war is a political instrument. So in other words, a state might want something, could be a chunk of land, it could be some resources or whatever, and if they can't achieve that goal, if they can't achieve that objective peacefully, then they may well actually resort to war. So you could say Clausewitz has a very excuse me, has a very sort of instrumental view of warfare. In fact, one of my old lecturers used to describe this sort of perspective on war as being rational. So war is a rational act. This is something that governments may choose to do to get what they want. So war is rational, war is national, meaning it involves states. So again, Clausewitz views war as an instrument that states use to achieve their objectives. So war is rational, national, and instrumental. So as I say, war is an instrument. This is something that states can use. Now, Clausewitz was writing, I think, end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century. So he was involved in the Revolutionary Wars. And I think this was a time when warfare was actually beginning to change quite radically. Excuse me. So in the 18th century, there were a lot of wars in Europe. So you have things like the war. Again, these are the English versions, the English references to these wars. But yeah, so you have like the War of the Austrian Succession, which I think was if I'm remembering my history now, I think that was in the 1740s. The 7 Years' War, 1756 to 63. I do remember that one. Etc. And for the most part, these European wars were fairly sort of limited wars. So they were sort of involving professional soldiers, but relatively small armies sort of clashing with one another. It's during the Napoleonic Wars or the Revolutionary Wars of the late 18th century, beginning of the 19th century, where I would say warfare begins to change quite radically. And this is where wars do really become national. This is where, so after the French Revolution, for example, the government, I think in French it's translated, sorry, the French version is lever en masse. So they introduced basically what we would refer to in English as conscription. In other words, they say, all relatively young adult men have to go out and fight. So suddenly you have an age of mass armies, and suddenly you have an age where governments suddenly take direct control, not just of the military, but of the economy, and they start mobilizing all the resources to pursue that. So in other words, there emerges a very sort of modern form of warfare, which sort of continues into the 19th century and then really results in the age, if you like, of mass warfare in the 20th century, when you see the outbreak of the First World War and the Second World War. But as I say, Clausewitz has a very realist perspective on warfare. So as I say, it's war between states, and it's states which have, as I say, particular goals, particular objectives that they want to achieve. Okay, yet another cartoon, and again, pretty similar point to some of the others that have been made. Again, we've got the military-industrial complex, this time represented as a car salesman. He's saying on the left-hand side, so, forget these old clunkers. So we can see these sort of rusting old cars. On the left-hand side, labeled Afghanistan War, Vietnam War, Iraq War. Behold the newest model. Behold meaning have a look at, see this new model. War on Iran, He says it's to die for. To die for, that's a sort of, it can be used as a sort of English expression, to die for, meaning something's really, really good, you'll love it. Yes, to die for. Okay. But obviously, it has a sort of double meaning here. And, the new model is the war on Iran. So again, the point being that the military industrial complex, um, according to this political perspective at least, and there are plenty of people who've made this argument that the military-industrial conflict sort of lives off war, lives off conflict. This is how defense industries make their money, and the argument is that perhaps the defense industries, the military, they have too much influence in American politics. So you think about lobbyists and people like that who sort of who put money into political campaigns and things like that. And little bird in the bottom right-hand corner. This is not your father's old Oldsmobile, he's saying. So yeah, so the latest war is being presented. Fortunately, to date anyway, there has not been a sort of direct clash with Iran. The Trump administration did launch an attack against Iran at the beginning of 2020, which killed an Iranian general. And there were fears that this might spill over into a wider conflict involving the United States and Iran, but fortunately it didn't. I think both sides, both the United States and the Iranians pulled back from that. Okay, and a question here. Why do states go to war? If we were doing this actually in class, I would at this point ask for your views, some answers. But I will give I will present some of the views you can find in the literature on international relations. We've talked about realism before, and the sort of classical realist explanation for why there is war, for why there is conflict, is they put it down to flawed human nature. So basically, people are bad. Okay, so flawed human nature. And that explains conflict. So let's say, you put two people, two men especially, in a room, they'll end up fighting, basically. So that's essentially it. So, just because people are bad and states are composed of people, politicians are people, etc. That is why we see conflict. A very simple explanation, and I think it's one which actually... I think most writers in the area would say, well, that's not really enough. Okay, just to say people are bad, that really isn't quite enough to give an explanation for why conflict occurs. I mean, at a most general level, it has to be true, because if we were all saints, then there wouldn't be conflict. But beyond that, it doesn't really tell us much. Two, to gain access to economic resources. So another sort of popular explanation. Marxists, but not only Marxists, would point to that. So they would say, ultimately it's conflict over resources. And you can certainly find examples in history where that has been the case. One that springs to my mind now is Japan in the late 30s, 1940s. Japan is a country which you could say is resource poor. So Japan itself doesn't actually have much in the way of natural resources. So the Japanese were sort of worrying about their need for oil and things like that. And that goes a long way towards sort of explaining why they embark upon the conquests of the late 1930s in China, then into Southeast Asia, which ultimately leads them into a direct clash with the United States and the Pacific War. The problem here is that you can find plenty of other wars, though, that aren't really sort of explicable in terms of economic resources, but it can certainly. an increase in a state's power. Okay, this is a reference. Again, I think we've mentioned this before, but this is a reference to what some international relations theorists talk about, the Thucydides trap. This idea that if one state is growing in power, then another state, another very powerful state or a dominant state might feel that actually they need to go to war in order to stop this country becoming even more powerful. The reason it's called the Thucydides trap is that Thucydides sort of gives this as an explanation for the outbreak of war between Athens and Sparta, and saying that the Spartans were basically becoming worried about Athens' growing power, so they felt that they had to go to war. And again, you can find other examples in history. So perhaps Germany, just before the First World War, was becoming worried about Russia's growing power, and a feeling among the German high command that if they didn't go to war against Russia around 1914, then it would be too late, that Russia would simply be too powerful to contain. Nationalist pressures, again, not hard to find examples in history where there's been sort of popular pressure. Again, you think about in various countries before the First World War. In English, sometimes we refer to it as jingoism. So that fear of foreigners, feeling that states might need to fight to protect their interests and things like that. National security, so going to war because you fear of particular threats. That would have been the Bush administration's justification for launching the war on terror after the 9/11 attacks. Increasing a government's domestic support. Having an external enemy, is a good way of bringing people together. And again, you can find examples of that throughout history. Nazi Germany sort of portraying Stalinist Russia as a sort of existential threat in the 1930s, for example, and sort of boosting support for the Nazi Party in that way. Glory. Maybe less relevant today, but perhaps in the past, perhaps especially in the sort of classical period, feeling that war was a way of strengthening a state's prestige. Popular pressure from the people, again, sort of similar, I suppose, to sort of nationalist pressure. So we can think of a variety of reasons. Probably no single war can be reduced to one explanation, but you might think that some explanations may be more convincing or more persuasive than others for explaining why wars break out. Okay, a bit of vocabulary here. I'll run through that, but you can check it yourself as well. First word, gorilla. This is not a reference to the animal. Okay, a mistake I made when I was a small child, when I heard gorillas referred to in the news, and couldn't quite understand why the television footage was not showing big apes as opposed to lots of fighting. No, gorilla is obviously a reference to an irregular fighter, so not a soldier in a regular army, so a partisan, if you like. So guerrilla, civilian, somebody who is not in the military. Hybrid warfare, this is a fairly new term, but often a reference, I know it's the same in Polish, but often a reference to the sorts of activities that Russia especially has been undertaking in recent years. So a range of activities sort of designed, I suppose, to sort of weaken the resolve of targeted states, weaken their security. Sort of ranging it from disinformation campaigns to cyber attacks, And in the case of Ukraine, um, putting in, seizing territories which would be a sort of higher end of the scale, but usually using methods short of outright warfare. Although in the case of the seizure of Crimea, that was a fairly blatant act of aggression. Non-combatants, so people who aren't actually fighting, but maybe on a battlefield or a zone of conflict somewhere. Total war, this is a reference to when states mobilize almost all their sort of national resources to fight a war. So you think about the First World War and the Second World War, these were total wars, Germany, Soviet Union, Britain, they were literally throwing everything at it in order to win. The obsolescence of war. When I started studying international relations in the 1990s, this was an idea that was quite popular, and this was the notion that basically war was becoming obsolete, meaning it no longer served a useful purpose. And this idea, I suppose, became quite popular with the end of the Cold War. There was a feeling that the international community was perhaps moving into a new era, something like that. Since then, of course, we've had 9/11 and a whole range of wars. So I think that idea has become less popular, if not completely discarded. A security community, that's a reference to a group of states where the levels of interdependence and, if you like, sort of institutional structures of cooperation are such that war has basically become virtually unthinkable or impossible to imagine. And the classic idea of a security community would be Western Europe during the Cold War, maybe the European Union today. Certainly, let's say the core of the European Union, maybe NATO as well. Sometimes we talk about the Euro-Atlantic community. Weapons of mass destruction, a reference to nuclear weapons, chemical weapons, biological weapons, which can obviously inflict mass casualties, mass damage. Cold War, hot war. Cold War is a state of conflict between two or more states, but we usually think about the United States and the Soviet Union after the Second World War. Some people argue that we are now witnessing a new Cold War between Russia and the West. Hot war is a war where there is fighting, so there is a direct clash between two states. An insurgency is a form of sort of partisan warfare, so guerrillas are involved in insurgencies. Usually, fairly sort of low-level campaigns. So going back to the map, we saw, parts of Africa, for example, like Nigeria with Boko Haram. They are experiencing insurgencies. New wars. This is a relatively new term, but these are wars which sort of describe the sort of conflicts that we saw in the 90s and the beginning of the 21st century. So sometimes civil wars which sort of spill over into neighbouring states, or the consequences of those wars spill over into neighbouring states in terms of refugee flows and things like that. They often bring in the international community, whether it's to providing peacekeepers or humanitarian aid, things like that. So again, fairly sort of low-level wars, but which do actually have quite destabilising consequences in the neighbourhood. The classic example would be sort of Yugoslavia, or the former Yugoslavia in the 1990s. More recently, perhaps we could point to something like Libya or Syria as falling into these categories. Failed states is a state where the sort of internal institutions have basically sort of collapsed. So Somalia might be considered to be a failed state, for example. One or two questions here. Are authoritarian governments more or less likely to wage war than democratic states? I think the general answer to this would have to be yes. if you look at the sort of conflicts around the world, most of them tend to involve governments which are not particularly democratic. Although that said, democracies do have a tendency to fight against non-democratic states, if they feel that their interests are sufficiently felt. So there are certainly plenty of examples of democratic states going to war. But democratic peace theorists would argue that it's almost sort of impossible to imagine a democracy going to war against another democracy. Certainly not many clear examples one can think of. Whether that rule will remain true in the future, I think, is open to debate. Has technology led to a major change in the nature of warfare today? Actually, one bit of terminology which I probably should have included on the list a moment ago, which I didn't, but which the textbook talks about, is this idea of a revolution in military affairs, and this idea that new technology has sort of transformed the nature of warfare. So things like smart missiles, computers, technologies, satellites, etc., that the sort of warfare, drones would be another really obvious example. The nature of war that countries like the United States, and probably China, and maybe one or two other countries are beginning to practice today is completely different from the sort of more, let's say, sort of modern forms of warfare that were practiced 30, 40, 50 years ago. I think there's a debate, though, as to whether the actual reality of war has been transformed quite as fundamentally as those, the revolution in military affairs suggest. I mean, more recently we've seen the situation in Afghanistan, where the United States was and its international coalition were involved in trying to sort of manage an insurgency in that country. And if you look at what was happening, in some ways it wasn't all that different from the sort of problems that the British were experiencing in Malaya in the 1950s, or the Americans in Vietnam in the 1960s. So, as I say, open to debate. Is it true that democracies don't fight one another? There's a debate there, as I say. The empirical evidence suggests that it is sort of very rare, for, if not to date at least, almost impossible to find an example of one mature democracy fighting against another. Whether that means it could not possibly happen in the future, as I said a moment ago, that is debatable. Has war become more brutal since the end of the Cold War? Again, an interesting question. We've yet to see, thankfully, a major clash involving two big powers, something that's comparable to the Second World War, say. A lot of people are worrying about the possibility of a clash between the United States and China. If that were to happen, then the consequences, I think, could be really, really devastating. On the other hand, you've had 9/11, so the world's most destructive terrorist attack. Al Qaeda was a particularly sort of waged a particularly brutal sort of campaign. ISIS as well. So, in some ways, maybe it has. On the other hand, Western states, I think, feel fairly limited, or they impose some limits in terms of their responses to these security threats when it comes to trying to avoid civilian casualties and things like that. Okay, right, I will leave it there. As per usual, there is some lesson materials to go with this, so have a look at those. So there will be a bit more vocabulary and stuff on that. But for this part of the class, I think I will bring it to an end here. So thank you very much. Goodbye.